Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this talk on a very cold evening, the first very cold evening of the year. Thank you, everyone joining online as well. I see there's a good turnout online as well. My name is Dr. Noémie Duo. I'm a lecturer here in modern European Jewish history. For those who don't know me, for this year's interfaith lecture, we have the honor to have Dr. Jeffrey Levin. Jeff is an assistant professor of Middle Eastern and Jewish Studies at Emory University in Atlanta. His first book, Our Palestine Question, Israel and American Jewish Descent, 1948 to 1978, was published in 2023 by Yale University Press. It won both the Saul Wiener Book Prize from the American Jewish Historical Society and the Southeast Regional Middle East and Islamic Studies Society's Book Award in Middle East Studies. And it is indeed a rare achievement for a book to receive both awards in both fields, American Jewish History and Middle East Studies. Jeff's book has been discussed in major newspapers and magazines, including in this country, The Guardian and the London Review of Books. He's now working on a second book examining historical American Jewish engagement with Middle Eastern and North African Jewish affairs, this year as a 2025-2026 Koch Junior Fellow in History at the University of Oxford. So Jeff, thank you for accepting our invitation to give this year's interfaith lecture and for coming down from Oxford to give this talk. The floor is yours. Let me know if you have any issue. Sorry. Where was it? Oh yeah, here. That would be better. Really?
We got another waiting room, yeah.
But normally Katie is doing the admitting.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everyone from the Parks Institute, and thank you for coming. It was coming down from Oxford was something, but definitely a lot closer than Emory, Atlanta, where I'm usually based. It's very exciting for me to do this talk because it's actually my first talk about the book in the UK or really anywhere physically outside of the US. I've done a good number of talks about this book. Sorry. And that I think speaks to the fact that it's a historical book very much, but also speaks to some of the broader questions in public discourse that are being discussed in the United States and in Jewish communal circles and beyond. Including like, what does it mean to be an American Jew? Or this question could apply to British Jews, other Jews in other countries. What does it mean to be an American Jew with regards to Israel-Palestine? Does it mean supporting Israel? Does it mean supporting refugees and minorities, including Palestinians? Does it mean somehow trying to do both? And if it is, like, is that something that is easy? Or was it? So again, a historical study, but something that I think has caught people's interest because it connects to some of the questions that are circulating, especially the past few years. So in very short summary, this book, which focuses on how American Jewish organizations grappled with Palestinian rights issues from 1948 to 1978, has a few main points. One is that this sort of dissent and advocacy engagement with Palestinian rights isn't something that just started, a couple of years ago, or just 20 years ago, or even in the 70s. There have been, as long as there have been questions like the Palestinian refugee issue, there have been American Jews, who've been debating and dissenting over these issues. So going all the way back to Israel's creation in 1948. And this is sort of a novel finding. No one had really written on this before. I also show in the book that the American Jews that were engaging with this issue were often people who had deep exposure to the region, people who lived in Mandate Palestine or Israel, people who had traveled to the West Bank, Gaza or Lebanon, not from people who, again, were isolated or distant from these issues. Three, I show that this dissent over Palestinian rights frequently was facilitated or limited by state involvement. And so by that I mean Israeli diplomats were very involved in sort of pushing back against American Jewish organizations or individuals who they felt were not really getting with their sort of program or their messaging regarding Palestinians. But I also show how people on the Israeli left sometimes inspired American Jews, how exposure and conversations with Palestinians, including people who worked for the Arab League or other sort of political outfits, influenced these conversations as well. And then the last point, which I don't make sort of explicitly in the book, but is there, maybe I would have in retrospect more, is that I show that mainstream American Jewish organizations didn't consider anti-Zionism to be inherently anti-Semitic in this period. So, like any discourse, there's something that comes about over time and in different contexts. So that's sort of the 2-minute takeaway. So I have this book. I showed you that the sort of the main takeaways, but really it's a book about people. So it's true that there were American Jews dealing with these issues going back to 48, but during the first 20 years, at least, there weren't that many American Jews that are involved in these questions. And the good thing for me is that the book allowed me to really focus on the stories of people. So as I'll talk about, the first 5 chapters of the 6 really focused on 1 or 2 individuals or their stories. People like Don Peretz, pictured top left there, an American Jew who had family roots in Jerusalem, going back to the Spanish Inquisition. He was Sephardic, who was the first American Jew to aid Palestinian refugees. I talk about his story. I'll get into that. This American Jewish Yiddish-speaking Yiddish journalist, William Zuckerman, who was based in the UK actually for 20 years, who founded a publication called the Jewish Newsletter in 1948 that is really consistently writing about Palestinian rights issues until the 1960s. I tell his story and how he gets sort of pushed out of mainstream American Jewish discourse. I talk about a sort of human rights lawyer and sort of elite Jewish figure, James Marshall. I'll get more into him. I'm fortunate to tell the story of a Palestinian spokesman who worked for the Arab League and his engagement with Jewish politics in the 50s, and how American Jews are dealing with his pro-Palestine, pro-Arab advocacy. I deal with this group of anti-Zionist reform rabbis, so progressive liberal rabbis, led by a guy named Elmer Berger, pictured there. And the last chapter, which deals with sort of more later stuff, the 1970s, deals with an array of people, including feminists, including broad organizations, national Jewish organizations in the 70s. Picture there's Aviva Cantor, one of these people who is trying to, disagreeing with Israel's policies toward the West Bank and Gaza, which it took over in 1967. So again, this is an intellectual project, but it's also one that really focuses on biographies and telling people stories. So people ask me how I got into this, and and I actually didn't set out to write this book. So I started this project. I started my PhD at NYU in 2013, and I went there to write something on U.S. Middle East relations from a diplomatic angle. But if you're a historian, you end up, dealing with the archives that are around you, if you're lucky. And so I ended up getting, as I'll talk about, into American Jewish history, because you don't have diplomatic archives in New York. But if you walk down the street from NYU, it's 16th Street. Some of you know, you'll get to the Center for Jewish History, and you get a lot of great American Jewish organizational archives. Anyway, while I'm at NYU, I'm taking courses about Israel, Palestinians, the Middle East, and the things that I knew about, and most of you probably know about, such as the fact that since 1967, Israel captured these territories, the West Bank and Gaza, considered occupied under international law. The people there don't have citizenship, and that's been sort of a human rights debate, including in American Jewish circles, but also much beyond since 1967. So learn a bit more about that, but that's kind of known. I also learned more about the Palestinian plight before 1967, so not just the populations living in those two territories. So in 1948, over 700,000, some say 750 or 800,000 Palestinians are displaced, either by fleeing or by being kicked out by Israeli or pre-Israeli militias during the same war in which Israel is created. So you have from 48 this sort of Palestinian refugee issue of Palestinians who are living in neighboring countries and regions. And that was actually a really big diplomatic issue for the U.S. and Israel in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. But you also had something that fewer people know about. I didn't know about until these first graduate student courses, and that's there's 156,000 people, so people who are Arab, Muslim, or Christian, who remain in the state of Israel, ultimately receive Israeli citizenship, but during Israel's first few decades lived under something that was called the military government. So even though sort of if you're familiar with the population known in Israel as Israeli Arabs today, or people who are, say, they're Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, they do have citizenship today. They didn't initially, and actually within Israel's first, 18 years, these not only, despite the fact that they did get citizenship in the 50s, they lived under the Arab populated areas of the country were placed under military rule. So that means they had restriction on movements. They had to get permits to go to other towns, which made it hard for them to find work. Some of them, the villages that they were from in Israel, they were not allowed to return to, even though they were living just a few towns over, because of military restrictions and so forth. There's sort of tweaking and corruption within the political system, and there's this land confiscation. So I learned about this for the first time, my first year at NYU. And I was thinking, I was also taking courses on American Jewish history, and I thought, well, American Jewish groups are at the same time are part of the civil rights struggle in the US. And that's a lot to unpack with American Jews' involvement in combating anti-Black racism and so forth. But they are part of that in a lot of ways. So I thought, there are obviously these civil rights issues for these people who are, citizens of Israel. And I thought, did the American Jewish groups do anything about this? And I found no one had really dealt with that issue before. And first place I looked was in the archives of the American Jewish Committee, which today is just one of a lot of American Jewish organizations. But in the 50s, it was arguably the most influential and prominent. This is before anyone heard of AIPAC or the Conference of Presidents or a lot of other organizations you may know about. It's founded in 1906. It has sort of affluent membership. It's supporting Jews who are suffering in Eastern Europe, combating anti-Semitism in the US. And it's arguing that Jews are like other Americans, arguing for minorities everywhere and displaced persons. And really, after World War II, begins speaking of itself as a human rights organization. So this group is liberal. It calls itself non-Zionist, but it is still, because it doesn't sign on to the ideological project of Jewish return to historic land of Israel, but it's sort of supportive with some hesitance of Israel after it exists. So I looked in the archives of these groups, this organization, which is one of the big three, but it's the most, which maybe heard of these other groups, but it's the most active internationally. It has, it's because it's sort of an elite, wealthy organization. Doesn't have the most members, but it has connections to, in the 40s and 50s, 60s, to the White House, and sort of the era, and is important in American foreign policy circles. So there's Kennedy with the AJC leaders in the early 60s, for example. So these archives are pretty easily available. Some of them are online, some of them are down the street. And so as a first-year graduate student, I looked and I found things quite quickly. I found that this was actually quite an adjustment. The fact that Israel is governing over another minority group. I mean, the entire Jewish experience in modern times before 40, pre-modern, not modern times, where Jews were minorities. So if you're a Jewish advocacy group, you're advocating for minorities. And suddenly here's a minority that is not Jewish in a Jewish state. And so they're grappling with this. They're concerned, also about if Israeli policy will lead to anti-Semitism in the US, if it's viewed as persecuting Christians or other groups. So I found a lot of really interesting material. The group is separate from my research, is really trying to draw a line to show that American Jews are not Israelis. It sort of pushes back whenever Israeli leaders say something that sort of implies that American Jews are not loyal to the US. So in that context, I find that this group in 1957 actually sent a delegation of its leaders to Israel as a kind of a fact-finding mission. After there'd been after in late '56 there'd been at the start of the Suez War, a massacre of several dozen of this Israeli Arab population. So it's something that really caused a lot of stir in the U.S. internationally. And so I can unpack that later. It's called the Kfar Qasim massacre. It was people who were unknowingly breaking a curfew at the start of the war, but they were Israeli citizens and killed by Israeli border guards. And it sort of blew the fact that there are this population, that they are facing issues into the fore, and sort of led to this group of American Jewish leaders, including some of these pictured here, to go to Israel to see what are the challenges, what's the truth and what's not the truth about this civil rights issues. And one of these leaders, this named James Marshall, they go around the country to these Arab villages to meet Arabs in Haifa and Jaffa, people who are Israeli citizens, and they learn that there are all these sorts of issues, in meeting with officials, so forth. And after doing so, they actually meet with Ben Gurion, the Israeli Prime Minister Ben Gurion, and really push for a major change in Israeli policy. You can see here, point out the military governorship, the land acquisition law, all these things that they do not view as sort of in line with their understanding of liberal democracy. They're very uncomfortable with raising these issues because on one hand, they're saying they're not Israeli citizens, but they're only loyal to the US. And so it's a bit uncomfortable. So they do this. Why are they doing this? Why do they push Israel to rethink its policy toward its minorities? One, it's being consistent. If they're a human rights organization, they need to, and there are other peer groups, Christian groups in the US, diplomats in the US, expect some level of consistency. Two, they are concerned about Israel. Three, they're concerned that Israel's mistreatment of Arabs, Christian, Muslim, otherwise, will lead to anti-Semitism in the US. That'll be highlighted, and indeed it was being highlighted by right-wing anti-Semitic groups whenever there's a war or massacre in the Middle East, and so that was one of their concerns. So one of the leaders of this AJC really wrote this long memorandum. Again, I found my first year of graduate school that no one had written about, really talking about the problems that he'd seen during his travels, and recommended all these sort of pragmatic and American liberal style solutions: more contact between Arabs and Jews, more autonomy, more integration. Arabs weren't allowed in Israel's labor union initially, expanding Arabic study, liberalizing all these restrictions that Israel's Arab population faced, and more. So he sends this, he decides not to publish it, and is told he's told months after months of delay from the prime minister's aide that, you don't understand what you're talking about. And it's sort of, the attitude that this early American Jewish groups encountered when pointing out these issues. So I had this paper, this project I wrote. I didn't actually think it would become a dissertation, much less a book. But I kind of kept on digging, and saw some of the names from this essay and project in other things that I was writing about. And I found one name of someone who worked for the American Jewish Committee when I was looking through the Israeli archives, and I found someone who knew him. He was in his 90s in DC, and someone told me, "Oh, maybe you'd be interested in this person who was the first AJC person to focus on the Middle East, like their staff member, but he was also the first person to write a dissertation or book on the Palestinian refugee issue in the mid-1950s." So I start, reading a bit more from one person to another, and I realized this is the American Jew who is most interested and involved in Palestinian refugee issues of his generation. So Don Peretz is this really fascinating figure. So he worked for the American Jewish Committee, but I also found that he had a much sort of deeper history, even separated from it. So he's the focus of my first chapter. He's born in 1922 to a father who was a Sephardic Jew. His family left, was kicked out of Spain during Spanish Inquisition. The family, like many Sephardic Jews, ended up in the Ottoman Empire. His family lived in Jerusalem for 400 years. His father sort of fled during World War I, has its own story. This guy, Don, is born in 1922 in Baltimore to a Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish mother and his father. He gets very involved in pacifism and actually serves in a non-combat translator role in World War II in Okinawa. And he gets very interested in what's going on in the Middle East because of his father's connection to the region, the fact that he has family over there. He hears that there's a pacifist in Israel as well. There are people like Judah Magnus, the head of Hebrew University, Martin Buber, a theologian who's a professor there, who are looking for binational solutions, a solution to the emerging Zionist Arab conflict that would not involve, any people being subjugated to another permanently or any people being displaced. And so he decides to use his sort of post-World War II, what we call the GI Bill, benefits to get his master's degree in Israel, not even Israel yet, in Mandate Palestine at this Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He, even though he hadn't really been very interested in Zionism prior, he falls in love with sort of the Jewish creative project in Mandate Palestine until the war breaks out in 1947. So he gets there in 46. What becomes the first Arab-Israeli war breaks out, and he's appalled sort of by the anti-Arab rhetoric of many of the Jews around him in Jerusalem. He writes for several publications, briefly gets abducted by an Arab militia when he's walking through the wrong neighborhood, who let him go safely after they find out, sort of his politics. But he becomes very interested in these Palestinian affairs. And so he leaves in the middle of the 1948 war, but when he hears that a Quaker pacifist organization is trying to aid Palestinians displaced by the war, he signs up. So part of this group, the American Friends Service Committee, goes to Gaza to aid refugees there. He works in the north in Akko, to help sort of displaced persons who are Arab in Israel's north. So again, this is the first American Jew to sort of engage in that way, witness some of Israel's policies. From there, he goes on to get a PhD at Columbia University, again, writing the first book on the topic of the Palestinian refugee issue. He goes to Beirut, he goes to Egypt, he goes to Israel, and again, writes what he felt was an objective book, and it's pictured there. So what's really interesting, though, even that alone would be of interest. But for me, the fact that he gets in the middle of this, and he's finishing his PhD, rather than being shunned by the Jewish organizational sphere, he actually gets hired by the AJC when they are, getting concerned about anti-Semitism that could come from the Israeli-Palestinian affairs, when they're getting involved in these sort of talks and other human rights issues. They actually hire him, and they hire him to create a philanthropic effort, interfaith effort with Christian groups to aid Palestinian refugees. However, and this was not like a radical, matter. It was a matter of literally just giving money and resources to Palestinian refugees in other countries. But as I show in the book, Israeli diplomats found him and this whole project to be quite threatening. And so from the time it's announced, the Israeli diplomats in New York are trying to get the agency to fire this figure, Don Peretz. And then they push him, and they ultimately decide, they don't fire him initially, but they decide the Israeli diplomats would have to look at all of his work that he writes for the AJC, because the AJC, was working with the State Department and so forth. And they view him as a really problematic figure, and I can get into that more later. His book comes out in 1958. Pictured here, where he tries to be sort of even-handed, but the Israeli diplomats are really upset about it, and they really nudge the AJC to let him go, and they do in 1958. And so again, Historica illustrates a lot of things that I see sort of more broadly in the book. The Israeli state involvement, the fact that he goes over there is sort of troubled but exposed to these voices, and sort of has this really interesting trajectory. So Don Peretz is the sort of first story in the book. I deal with others, such as this journalist, William Zuckerman, and this anti-Zionist group of anti-Zionist progressive rabbis who, in their own different ways, are dealing with these issues publicly and facing pushback as well, in part by Israeli officials. So this journalist, William Zuckerman, who's writing about Palestinian refugee issues in the 40s and 50s, initially actually his work is published in the major Jewish newspapers in the early 1950s. But there's a really concerted effort from the Israeli diplomats like Abe Harman for him to, so the American Jewish circles to sort of push him away. Israeli diplomats, he was the correspondent for the London Jewish Chronicle, and Israeli diplomats sort of pushed the Chronicle to let him go. And so this sort of once mainstream Yiddish writer, who at the time was writing in English, sort of pushed out amidst that. Similarly, the anti-Zionist Reform Jewish group is sort of subject to a schism when some of the Israeli officials, like a guy named Teddy Kollek here, is involved in sort of courting some of the more moderate members of this group, and ultimately contributes to a schism. So again, writing this is a really international story. I have a chapter that I'm happy to talk more about that again deals with a Palestinian figure, Fayyad, pictured right here. He was born in Palestine. He studies at Georgetown University for a PhD while the 1948 war is breaking out. And he and his family flees, and he can never sort of return to what turns into the state of Israel. So he is a very bright person. He has a PhD from Georgetown, and he ends up getting very involved in sort of the diplomatic circles in the US that are pushing for America to distance itself from Israel and ally with the Arab world. So he's speaking at a lot of DC circuit sort of things. He gets connected with some of these anti-Zionist rabbis, and they really have an influence on each other. And I focus on him, including his time as ultimately the leading spokesman for the Arab League in the 1950s, and how American Jewish groups aren't really sure what to do to deal with him. Because American Jewish groups see that there are some Arab diplomats, some Arabs, and some anti-Zionist voices in the U.S. that are, clearly anti-Semitic, that are saying things that are really problematic. There are some Arab figures at the time, but this figure, Saig, is not. And there's debates over that between the ADL and the American Jewish Committee and so forth. And then the leaders of the American Jewish Committee actually meet with him, and they try to find a way. And I show how the American Jewish Committee and American Jews try to deal with the fact that this person is very much critical of Israel, but nothing he's saying is actually, seems to be critical of Jews at whole, but it's making people uncomfortable, and so they meet and just try to find a way. How can he, advocate for his political views about Israel and Zionism without, causing prejudice or concern for American Jews? They don't really come to a conclusion. But the fact that American Jewish groups are grappling with these issues and their positions are changing over time, I think is quite important. So again, the first 5 chapters are dealing with these individuals. It's sort of mostly the 1950s. But in the late 1950s and 1960s, things are starting to change. So a lot of what's leading to some of this anti-Zionism or non-Zionism in American Jewish circles, this criticism of Israel, is the fact that some of these American Jewish leaders are afraid of anti-Semitism. It's not totally clear that Israel is that popular amongst the Christian population in Israel's first 10 years or so. American Jews have come out of a period in the 1940s of great anti-Semitism. There's still not sort of a full integration as there would later be. But as the 50s turn in the 60s, things change. So there's positive images of Israel in the American cultural sphere. blockbuster book and film that's sort of called Exodus that Americanizes Israel's founding. American Jews are becoming much more integrated into the white American mainstream, suburbanizing. And so the discomforts of 1950 are very much different than the mid-1960s, when American foreign policy is drifting toward Israel, and when Americans sort of see Israel's dramatic victory and capturing of Jerusalem in 1967, and Americans at large see Israel more as a potential asset rather than a liability. So a lot of the insecurity about supporting Israel goes away, and a lot of the pride for American Jews with regards to Israel is on the increase. So my last chapter deals with sort of what happens after the 67 war, when Israel, talk about the details of the war, so someone can be its own lecture. But the main thing is throughout the Six-Day War in June of 67, Israel captures large amounts of territory from Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, but most importantly, in the long run, the West Bank and Gaza, which are Palestinian populated. And unlike and these populations not given citizenship. So these are questions. So, the population that I was talking about before, either they were refugees or they're people who had Israeli citizenship, at least on paper. And here's a population of Palestinians, at the time hundreds of thousands, now millions, who's living under Israeli rule without anything sort of, not any sort of semblance of equality. And so there are American Jews who are troubled by this. How does this work? What should that solution be? And there emerges in this period in the 1970s, among some Israeli circles and Jewish circles elsewhere, and Arab circles as well, that one potential solution to this conflict could be creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, what we now call the two-state solution. So in the early 1970s, there's a lot of small groups, American Jewish groups, who are talking about this, and there ends up being one sort of national group that emerges called Be'erah. And Be'erah was basically arguing that if Israel wants to secure its future as a Jewish state and then live in peace with its neighbors, it needs to recognize the Palestinian aspirations, potentially through the creation of a Palestinian state. So this is a group that some people had written about before. But what I talk about is the way in which their story had been sort of portrayed as one that's, something, these people are leftists, they're not interested in Jewish politics or Israel really, and I show that the way in which these people became involved in the question is actually by traveling over there. I show the leaders of these groups and similar groups didn't come to these views sort of just on American college campuses. They often came to these views by traveling to Israel, spending a year or 6 months studying abroad or living in Israel, and often meeting with Palestinians. So it's quite easy to meet Palestinians in the late 1960s if you were living in Israel because of the borders. There was no, it was very nebulous. And they often saw inspiration not from sort of left-wing circles in the US, but actually from left-wing circles in Israel. So the fact of the matter is they were so inspired by sort of the left-wing voices who are also advocating for recognizing the Palestinians that they sort of felt, and some of the left-wing voices were former generals or so forth, who actually did begin negotiating with the PLO. So there are these initial negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, which was viewed as very taboo in the 1970s. When sort of moderate Palestinian, most moderate members of the Palestinian establishment are meeting with these sort of dissidents of the Israeli establishment. And what happens is some of these figures in Be'erah, the American Jewish group, see this, and they also meet with some of these Palestinian sort of moderates. And these meetings are sort of they're supposed to be confidential, but some people who are not in Be'erah leak or let the Israeli diplomats know about these meetings, and then leak it to the press, and becomes this sort of very large controversies over because this group will not sort of disavow meeting with the Palestinians because they believe that negotiations are required for a solution. And so this is sort of the beginning of a new era, and sort of is where my book ends, when there are these big sort of public debates, and this group is Beraa is totally villainized for meeting with the Palestinians, called Jews for the PLO, Jews for terrorism, essentially, and totally ripped apart, even though they'd been so inspired, actually by their time in Israel, even though they felt very committed to Jewish politics and Jewish causes. So again, I really pieced together these stories and sort of show that there are some similarities. So there are generation of people, different generations of people who went to Israel, went to the Middle East, and saw what they viewed as problems and were influenced by Israelis, and came to the United States to try and spread those issues from the 40s to the 70s at a time when not many people were raising them. But they often faced pushback, often by fellow American Jews, but as I show from Israeli diplomatic files, also by Israeli diplomats. So, obviously these are micro histories. These are little stories, but they lead to some broader questions. What does it mean to be an American Jew or British Jew or non-Israeli Jew when a Jewish state exists? How did groups deal with this sort of transformation of what Jewish advocacy means? Does advocating for Jewish causes in the United States mean advocating for American Jews? Does it mean advocating for Israel? Are Israeli interests and American Jewish interests always the same? Are they allowed to be publicly blurred? Publicly shown that they're different? What can we make of this history of Israeli, extra either state intervention in American Jewish politics? What should the historical and present day Jewish experience of being a minority mean for Jews' identity and purpose vis-a-vis Israel? Does it mean that these other stories of Palestinians who are displaced, like many American Jew and British Jews ancestors, mean that their story should resonate? Does the fact that some Palestinians live as a minority, like American Jews are, should that resonate? Or is the fact that the Jewish solidarity come above all, especially in light of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism ongoing challenges? And again, the last thing is really, what does this all mean for the Palestinians? There's been a lot of books written on American Jews in Israel, on Zionism in Britain and elsewhere throughout the world. But I think what this book does is really focus on the Palestinian problem at the forefront, and then see how that fits into everyone else and how it makes you rethink these questions of Zionism, anti-Zionism, non-Zionism, and so forth. So with that, I'd really love to hear any questions you have. I'm happy to elaborate on any of the things. I tried to give you an overview, but there's still a lot to fill in. So thank you.
Questions either from the room or from our online audience.
Maybe stop sharing.
Yeah. Sure. Okay, we have a question from Tony.
Thank you very much. Could I support another cycle when you talk about those that are engaging with Palestinian groups and individuals? So how have you been able to see how the Palestinian individuals saw these initiatives? Were they see them as having potential, or they see them as marginal Jewish voices?
Yeah, so that's a great question.
Wait, we just need to repeat the question
Okay.
for the audience. So do you want to repeat it? So what's the view of Palestinian groups that was Tony view these initiatives by American Jews, like what potential they see for these initiatives?
Yeah, so the PLO and Palestinian nationalist movement really emerges in late 50, the PLO is in 65, but it's taken over in late 60s by Fatah, this sort of radical, initially radical movement led by Yasser Arafat, who they launched attacks on people. So they're very unpopular in the early 1970s, to say the least, amongst American Jews. But as the 70s go on, this sort of radical leadership, there begins to become schisms within PLO. There's some people within the PLO who say we want all of historic Palestine. Jews can be a minority or gone, but there's also figures who are saying, well, look, the Arab armies aren't defeating Israel in 67, 73, but there's a potential solution for this Palestinian state. And so Arafat, who leads the PLO from the 60s till his death in 2004, is kind of playing both sides. And he allows these moderates to meet with Israeli leftists and with American Jews. He essentially sends them to the United States in 1976. And these two figures, two most moderate figures, one guy's named Issam Sartawi. He was a Palestinian refugee who was educated in Iraq and in the United States, a heart surgeon who ends up, after 67, moving back to the Middle East, and initially is very militant, but then comes around and to a more moderate view. And another guy he's ultimately assassinated by sort of in the 80s by by groups who are more rejectionist and don't like his political views. The other person is a guy named Sabri Jirius. And Sabri Jirius is someone who is raised in Israel. He was born in 1938, and he actually has a law degree from Hebrew University, and grew up around Israelis. And he ended up leading the PLO's research center. So he's more of an academic think intellectual. He's still alive. So I was able to go and meet him and talk with him, ask him these questions. You met with American Jewish groups, including some Jewish leaders. There were even some meetings with Jewish leaders that weren't reported. And basically, there wasn't a lot of optimism for this. But the question was, look, America is so important in US foreign policy, and American Jewish groups were very influential in shaping, can the Palestinians have an office in Washington, D.C.? So for instance, in this specific instance, they were literally hoping that they would soften the opposition of American Jews to there being a delegation office in Washington, D.C. They didn't think that they were going to Sabri, at least the one who survived, that his colleague was more optimistic that American Jews can be part of the solution, and so forth. Look, they're so influential in American foreign policy and so forth was the idea, but at least Sabri years later, opinion was, it's going to be hard to get anything to budge there. But the rhetoric at the time were, it's just a ploy. This is a Palestinian trap. The critics of these organizations and people. Ultimately, you see one of these people died for his views, and the other person, actually, Sabri Jirius lives in Israel again now. And so the Palestinians, even if their organization was not, their effort was. But I don't think they were totally naive about the odds of progress.
I have a question online from Jeremy Rose.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for that.
We can't hear you, Jeremy.
Maybe it's
Oh, sorry. Would be
Is
a
it,
good
wait,
idea.
maybe it's us? What do I need to do?
Yeah, I'm not muted.
Should I change the audio?
try again.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Speaker.
I'll put it in the
I
chat.
can hear you. Zilke can hear. Oh, this one you mean?
Yeah. Try.
I'll put it in the chat if nobody can hear me.
We can hear you on Zoom.
Yeah,
Yeah,
online. they're
right.
clear.
But if the speaker can't hear me, there's not much point. I'll put it in the chat. Okay.
I can hear you
Yeah.
a little bit, but maybe
Okay,
the chat's better. Okay, great.
Sorry about this.
I think.
Yeah. I guess we can take another question from the chat at the same time. In the time period you look at, do you see change or evolution in how the Holocaust is discussed or invoked in reference to Israel by the individuals and groups you look at?
Definitely, the Holocaust always looms large in Jewish politics, from 40s onward. There's an interesting little anecdote. So I mentioned there's this Yiddish journalist who's writing after 48 this Jewish newsletter, and he translates this story about a woman, a Holocaust survivor, who moves with their children or moves and has children in Israel, and she's given a house that had belonged to Arabs, Palestinian refugees. And, they find toys in the closet, which were the toys of the Palestinian people who left. And she's deeply troubled by this. And actually this writer who who's critical of Israel, and he said actually this is good news, because look, the Holocaust refugees and their experience will serve as a bulwark. They'll be a sort of a new moral force, actually, on sort of his views, support of his views politically. So that was quite interesting. The Holocaust, and I think you see this in a lot of American Jewish history, in these early decades is always there, but not evoked as explicitly in the 50s and 60s as in the 70s and beyond, which is interesting because more people are alive and have experienced it and so forth. But it becomes something that people talk about more explicitly as central to their Zionism or support for Israel, especially after 67, which I think had been this moment when it looked like these Arab states were surrounding Israel and were about to attack, and Israel maybe was going to be destroyed. At least that was the feeling. Historians will debate the reality of that, but the feeling in Jewish circles was that, look, it could happen again. And so really after that, it became central to some of these conversations in a new way. So the Holocaust and sort of was cited a lot in the criticism of the Brera group, like how could you're risking it happening again, like you're being like all these negative names that Jews always hurl at each other. It really emerges more in the 70s. Yeah.
Should we take another? Oh, no, there's a question from the audience.
Yeah.
We'll alternate.
I actually have two, but I'm quite happy to split them up. They're not related. The first one is to ask you about the prior DNA of all of this. What was the situation? What were the attitudes before the founding of the State of Israel? Perhaps even back beyond the Balfour Declaration to the time of Weizmann and the original concept of Zionism. What was the awareness of the Palestinian existence and its status in those days prior to 1948?
So I'll divide it as our anti-Zionism or resistance to Zionism, into Jewish anti-Zionism into two different ways. One is anti-nationalism. So this idea that Jews aren't a nation, we belong here in America or Britain or whatever else. And this idea that Jews are a constituted nation and should be moving to historic land of Israel. Yes, Israel is part of Jewish history and religion, but we're here. And you see that in the 19th century from American Jewish elites, people who have their roots in Central Europe, but the Pittsburgh Platform, a Reformed Jewish document of the late 19th century, basically says that. And so there's a lot of skepticism when American Jews are really embracing this American identity toward that. That being said, after Balfour, there is an active Zionist movement. And part of that is fueled by the fact that there's all these Eastern European Jews who come in and transform what American Jewry looks like in the early 20th century and right before. But also represents some progress even made in these elite circles. But the real transformation comes in Jewish politics with the Nazi German issue. Suddenly, it's not just, oh, are Jews a nation? Are they a people? And then you have, okay, there's these Jews who are threatened and Jews being killed, and then afterward, where do they go? And so that's a big issue. The other type of anti-Zionism isn't anti-nationalism, but it's anti-Zionism because of its implications for the Palestinians. And you really can't expect average American Jew of 1920, 1930, maybe wasn't particularly at the forefront of any sort of social justice issue to really be that caring about this. But this does emerge over time in the 50s, and I show how some of these people in my story, these Reform rabbis, go through this trajectory where they go from being anti-nationalist to being pro-Palestinian. But even though they're not caring about the individuals, they're looking at the numbers in Mandate Palestine. And even in 48, Jews are only a third of Mandate Palestine. And in the 20s, they're like in the teens. So like, if you're American, a normal liberal, a normal American, you're looking, well, I believe in democracy. How does that work? When it's clear these Arabs don't want them there. So you see a lot of people engaging with it, being like, well, maybe about nationalism, or maybe some sort of compromise, or maybe something. And I mean, there are true believers of American Zionists, but a lot of people are just like looking at this and saying, Jewish state, like, how is that supposed to work? So yeah, there's lots to unpack with your question.
Thank you. I'll come back to a second if I may.
I'll ask Jeremy Rose's question. And, to what extent did the Jewish organizations in the United States, AJC, etc., represent the overall Jewish view there? You mentioned that they were formed by well-off and well-connected people with maybe a me-first agenda. Is there any source for a wider view of Jewish opinion in the US rather than just a narrow demographic?
Yeah, so I deal with this organization, which is influential, you know, in terms of the DC and people who have made the means and so forth, but they don't represent the wider body. And ultimately, I think they're sort of, you know, what is British Jewish leadership? What is American Jewish leadership? They're not like all the Jews have a election in November of every 4 years, like in the US, where people can decide. You know, it's sort of the self-appointed aspects to it, and it's a bit complicated. So most American Jews, I don't think, agreed quite with the AJC. I think there was more fondness, even in this early period, for Zionism, even if it wasn't fully formed. On the other hand, like, you don't, like, who's a Zionist? Like, are most American Jews Zionist? Like, if you ask most, I don't know American Jews, if you support Israel, you would definitely get a majority of American Jews, a solid majority. Like, who defines what Zionism is? You know, including in this period, like, a lot of these organizations in the 50s didn't use the term Zionist for themselves. Later they did. So it's complicated. But I'd say something that is important with the AJC is they end up coming around to supporting Israel more, because that's what the American Jews around them were. They said, okay, this guy who's anti-Zionist, he's not anti-Semitic, but he's making everyone uncomfortable, and we kind of have to listen to people, you know, about that. And so there's this movement over time and following, in a sense, the base.
We'll take a question from the chat from Sarah Goldsmith. What can we American Jews do to work toward justice for Palestinians and Palestine now? What organizations might you recommend we work with?
That's less my wheelhouse. I mean, it's a super challenging time. You know, I think trying to get behind the support actors over there, you know, standing together as a group is very active. But look at the organizations and people who are pushing back against, you know, again, this isn't the book. This is me, a historian, but, you know, there's efforts to say, okay, one people should be here and the other people should be gone, and one people should be in charge of everyone, and, you know, the other should just be subjugated. And so looking at the organizations that resonate with you and so forth, you know, I think and maybe I'm here in Britain now, but those of us who aren't there. Yeah, I think that's important to recognize the limits of our understanding of the reality on the ground, the limits of American Jews' ability to influence things. Is a message of my book, actually. I think there's often overestimation. And so, yeah, I think sort of just finding the voices who resonate over there, or of whatever background. Yeah. Good question.
I think one of the things which I'm missing from what you've been talking
Yeah.
about is the changing the influences in the US and of the Mizrahi Jews, from the Jewish refugees that have come from, let's say, Syria, where my family came from, or Lebanon, or not so much Jordan, but Egypt as well, that many moved to New York and to the US, and they will have had their own sets of prejudices and views on how Israel should work. And in fact, even now, up to now, the vast majority of Israelis, Jewish Israelis, have their background from Middle Eastern countries. So there's that dynamic, which I think might be missing in some of your interpretations of what's going on and the influences in the US. and influences going backwards into Israel and the relationships with say Fatah or whoever it was.
Yeah,
So-
Just repeat the question for the people on Zoom. So the influences of in the US of Mizrahi Jews, so Jews who have their roots in Arab lands, so people from Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, who did migrate to the US, East Coast, but also West Coast actually, who came with their own set of views and potentially prejudices as well. So how did that impact and what role it played in the
So I
industry?
can give you either a non-answer or a great answer, and that is, you're right, it's missing, and that's the next book. So I'm working on a book, that's really my next book that I'm working on now at Oxford, is really how the stories of Mizrahi Jews influenced American Jewish politics with relations designs and so forth, because it's interesting, it's fascinating, it's related to this. That being said, in terms of the raw sort of influence, so my book, this book ends in 78. So, you know, in terms of actually, like, you know, I mean, obviously you say your family moved very early. There are Jews from Syria living in Deal and living in Brooklyn very early. In terms of the raw numbers and raw sort of influence, the ability to influence organizations and politics, I think that's emerging sort of in the 70s more. I mean, I'm not saying they don't have their own organizations, Sephardic organizations, but I think you can definitely see that influence now. But you don't see, I mean, you actually do have one person I focus on, this guy, Don Peretz, whose father is from, you know, Jerusalem, but there's not like even though they're having conversations, there's not like this, there's X number of Syrian Jews who have an active vocal organization who I'm finding in that book. But the overall message of the Mizrahi Jewish experience and how Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews in the US read that, I think, is really important. So thank you.
Look forward to the next.
Yeah, me too.
Right. So the question from the chat: within the last 20 years, do you feel the rise of anti-Semitism is due to actions taken against Palestinians and how it has grown more and been more documented, or do you think it is due to other underlying causes?
Well, there's a lot, you know, it's a lot to unpack there, and certainly in the US and I think in the UK, like anti-Semitism has become a much greater issue. Can you keep the question?
Sorry,
up so
sorry,
I can
sorry.
keep
Yeah,
an eye on it. You know, there's what resonates, you know, now, I can't separate, but now, I don't know how many of you follow things in the US, but there's this Nick Fuentes, there's these Groypers, there's this Marjorie Taylor Greene, there's this all new, like new thing that didn't exist 20 years ago, that there's these right-wing, super right-wing people who are also, you know, tweeting, Xing, whatever they call, about like Palestinians. And not because they love Palestinians, it's because like these people hate Jews. And they're using the Palestinian and outrage of the Palestinian in a very explicit way. Like these people, there's no debate, oh, these people, like they're literally saying that Jews are causing problems, you know, like it's textbook. And what's interesting is this is exactly, I think, what 70 years ago, these people I'm looking at are afraid of. They're afraid of that, you know, again, this is not long after the Holocaust, not long after McCarthyism. The numbers in the 1940s in the US in terms of anti-Semitism, of not wanting Holocaust refugees are astounding in the 40s. It seemed to go in the 50s, but the American Jewish leaders are the same. And they see these right-wing, the grandfathers of Nick Fuentes are literally taking, you know, the pictures from Arabic language things of massacres in Gaza, because there were massacres in Gaza in 56, and using them in their material. And so they're afraid of this. And that's part of the reason they're doing this. So, you know, it's kind of this age-old question of like, is Israel causing anti-Semitism, or is Israel a solution to anti-Semitism? And, you know, I think there's so much. I mean, I think that's part of this equation, the fact that there's a decline of a two-state solution. You know, it used to be we had this, you know, great paradigm that was just, the narrative was, oh, it's just going to happen eventually and these problems will be solved, and it's not. Instead, there's been more violence, there's more images of violence, there's more unfiltered images of violence. I think certainly that's part of it, but there's also this conspiracy, especially in the past 6 years, COVID, that's increasingly conspiratorial mindset. I think just the internet overall has allowed conspiratorial ideas to flourish. We have no gatekeepers for knowledge in the same way we did. Like, you don't need to like go to find a publisher if you have a bunch of crazy ideas. You can just do whatever. But certainly I think it's not part of the picture either. But on the other hand, it's there's a lot to unpack.
And you had another question as well?
Yes, I do, and I hope it's a development rather than a repeat of Jeremy Rose's point. I wonder whether you've come across any evidence of a grassroots dimension of this, rather than, I think, understandably, the elite focus. So, does this ever come up with Hadassah or B'nai B'rith in the community at the real ground level? I mean, does it ever appear in the forward or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a little here and there, JDC and stuff, but I talked about gatekeepers of knowledge, and Israel's image in these, Israel's foreign ministry in the past few decades has been a mess. It's a joke. Like, honestly, their efforts, like, they don't do anything. They used to have Abba even. They used to have incredibly competent people in the 1950s and 60s running this operation.
Yeah.
And now it's a political joke. They give it, Netanyahu gives these jobs to, no matter what you think about Netanyahu or these people, like, they're just not competent at it. They're not actually aiming to improve Israel's image. They're aiming to gain political points at home. In 1950s and 60s, you had just an apparatus of journalists, of foreign office that could help mold and talk about stories. And I think one of the big things in terms of the image of Israel and what's right and what's wrong and direct is about the idea of time, the idea of things are getting better or things are not. I think when you had people seeing these issues in the 1950s, to the extent they saw them and problematized them, like the issue with Arabs not being allowed in the labor union or restrictions, the narrative was, and I think again the Foreign Office and the Foreign Ministry and whatever, but there's that it's being dealt with, and part of that was an easy sell because of who the leadership of Israel was. For these 30 years, except for 1977 and 70, labor, the Mapai, the socialist establishments leading Israel, and I think they're very credible to a lot of Jews, leading Jews in the United States. Bernie Sanders goes into kibbutz, Noam Chomsky goes into kibbutz. I'm not always happy with what they see, like Chomsky, but this idea is that things are, and you had it with the two-state solution for a while. Like, obviously, there's moral issues with the West Bank, like Israel's control of the West Bank, if you think people should have citizenship and some form of equality. But if you have this narrative that, oh, it's just going to be getting better, then maybe it's less of an issue. So I think there was a lot of that. There was a lot less travel to the region, and in this period than there is now. I think that's important. A lot less exposure to kind of crazy Israeli voices. Like you see Peretz's view. You see that in Peretz's books that he says that some Israelis are very hard line. If you are an American Jew or British who goes on Birthright today, you'll see, if you're 20, you'll go see that a 20-year-old Israeli has very right-wing views. And so there's this level of exposure to realities, to opinions that there wasn't at this time. Hadassah did a lot of, Hadassah before Israel's created is this women's, Zionist organization that is working to, help Arabs as well as Jews in Mandate Palestine and afterward. But there's a question of who to blame for these issues too. And if the narrative is, oh, well, the Arabs left in 48 and Israel has no blame, and it's the Arabs' fault, or these problems are going to be resolved, that sort of worked to a certain extent. And there weren't voices in the United States so much outside of like society to really counter that. So yeah, no, I see in my last chapter in the 60s and 70s, you have people who had gone over there in the 60s or 50s and were kind of like unsettled by what's going on, but they didn't like ever seek to take control of Hadassah or really influence them in any sort of major way. So yeah. I mean, look at the refugee issue. What was one reason? In 1956, the Israeli diplomats were just hoping it would just go away. Just don't talk about it, it'll go away. Here we are in 2025. It's clear that it's not. how things went out. Yeah.
Okay. And one last question in the chat. Do you feel Israel plays into anti-Semitism in America, I guess, to radicalize American Jews on the side of Israel as a safe space, while still holding political power in America by propping up politicians who take AIPAC money partnered with the threat of being perceived as an anti-Semite? Yeah, I'm trying to listen.
So I mean, it's something I sort of take away from this question is like there's a question of Jewish safety. Is there an embrace, of this idea that America is unsafe in order to raise support for Israel? Yeah, I'm just having a little trouble unpacking this. Yeah.
I'm sure she's taken it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, it's not exactly answering the question. But like this whole idea of Jewish safety, I think is very interesting and important. Like, is America safer for Jews? Or Britain safer for Jews than Israel? Like numerically, like it's extremely tragic and so sad what's happened in Manchester, last month, and what happened in Pittsburgh in the U.S. 7 years ago. Unfortunately, these things happen all the time to Jews and to other people in the United States but numerically, I mean, October 7th, the numbers of Jews who are unfortunately killed in Israel and other, like numerically, you are more likely as a Jew, more likely to face violence in Israel than you are in the United States. So it's interesting. What are these debates, about safety in the U.S. and safety in Israel, and how do those play into support for Israel, opposition to Israel? I think that's quite fascinating. So.
I had a question about labels. In the last 2 years,
Yeah.
I've seen how a lot of labels are used without precise definitions. Like the big one is Zionist or anti-Zionist. And then you start unpacking person's view and you realize, okay, this is not exactly what I thought. I was wondering if the actors you look at that define themselves as non-Zionist, like what kind of political present and future they envisage for Israel Palestine, or they just say we are non-Zionist. Like how do they give a definition of that?
What does it mean to be a Zionist? Like to a certain extent, it's in certain people's interest to blur this question, because like in this early period, it was interesting because like in the 40s, like you'd be a card-carrying labor Zionist or card-carrying like revisionist Zionist. Like you'd have an ideology that you believed in, and like that would mean something. And if you weren't involved in that project of Zionist organization, then you weren't a Zionist, even if you supported the idea of a Jewish state. And most Jews did. I mean, so somebody asked me about numbers. So in, I think it was 1946 poll, it was like, Jews support, for the displaced peoples to go to Palestine, and like 80% do. And 10% are against it, and 10% aren't sure. So this is 1946. So I'm sure if you ask people in 1946, how do you consider yourself Zionist? The number would not be anywhere close to 80%. I think sort of the definition of Zionism became sort of softened and broadened into something that doesn't really, oh, you support Israel, oh, you think Israel shouldn't be destroyed, you're Zionist. And so, what does that, really sort of mean? It's also used as an insult in certain, negative ways. And so, yeah, I think there's been an effort to show that there's a Zionist consensus in American Jewish politics. And sort of a way of doing that was to broaden the definition as much as they can. But in a way, it's been lost of all meaning. It looked like there were these philosophers and thinkers from the 19th and early 20th centuries who wrote books about what it meant to be Zionist, and no one, people don't read them. And I think there's just a little bit more questions about what those things sort of mean. I think a lot of these people who call themselves non-Zionist, I think, just felt like they didn't buy into the nationalist idea. They didn't believe that Israel is the culmination of the Jewish experience and Jewish history, but they didn't necessarily want it to be destroyed. In fact, maybe they thought practically it's a place where Jews live. Okay, it's fine. We'll support it, even though we're not in love with the idea. So.
And then today, this kind of label has disappeared, let's say, from debates, I would say. I think we have one last question just behind it. Sorry, yeah.
As a historian, as someone who's so well versed in the history and you talked about the history leading up to the development and the establishment of Israel. I was wondering what your stance is right now about Israel's behavior towards Palestinians and the atrocities it is committing in Gaza and the West Bank.
I just missed you missed a few words leading up to what?
What your stance is about the current circumstances and about Israel's behavior towards Gaza and West Bank.
Yeah, I mean, it's a total mess. I mean, look, I mean, you have what's happening with the West Bank, which is in a way, I don't know if it's simpler or not, but I mean, what's the future of these territories? Like, how can you see any sort of moral situation emerging from here? There's increasing numbers of Palestinians in the West Bank losing their homes and lands, and like, how does that fit in with any sort of Western liberal, progressive, Jewish, sense of ethics? And Gaza was before October 7th, 2020. What was the future of this land where there's all these million, millions of people living there in this small space? So it's this whole outlook seems quite dark. And unfortunately, you have larger numbers of people, and there's only emerging that feel that there's only room for one people to dominate this land between the river and the sea, and then the sort of more right-wing voices are winning out. And it's really hard to see a way out of it politically. I think the only way I look for hope is that you kind of never know what's going to happen in history. Some of the greatest developments, there's no good signs in my opinion, for the future of what's going on here. But that doesn't mean there won't be something else. Usually unexpected things are bad, but hopefully, Thank you.
Can I just say that
Yeah.
ties into the previous
Yeah.
question as well? Because you see recently over the last few years, an attempt to polarize political views in the US in particular. You've seen it's to going, well, you're either Republican or Democrat, and the chasm is widening. You get the feeling that you're either one or the other. The same with your Zionist or anti-Zionist, you're pro-Palestinian or you're pro-Israel. And there doesn't appear to be any room for middle ground, which is what's needed in any agreement, settlement, long-term point. And do you see this happening in the States as much? Because I see it from general US politics, and from what you have been saying, that also among, you're either Zionist or you're not Zionist, even the way that you're saying, rather than what you said just at the end. What you were saying before was that there is a middle ground, but it's not defined.
Well, I think there's either 2 or 3 or 4 positions here. Like, one is that this is a zero-sum game, and one is that there needs to be something else. So you might be someone who believes that, because of history or religion, that the Palestinians deserve this land either exclusively or to dominate, or that because of religion and history, the Jews deserve this land and to dominate it entirely. And in a way, those views are the same, is that this is a problem where one side is going to suffer and lose and be subjugated or exiled. And then there's people who say, well, actually, it's bad for people to be kicked out of their homes. It's bad for people to be killed. And we need to find and grapple with to find some sort of productive solution that, that rejects the idea that this is a zero-sum game, and we'll fight until the end to try and find something that doesn't involve people being displaced or killed. And that's hard. Like, that's not a clear solution. We had, the one's more of a consensus over 2 states, but there's, different people, groups, and activists and people who try. Well, the one problem is there's people trying to obscure these things. People who try to say that they're they support this as a state solution, but then are doing things that sort of to push it up to make it harder, or people who are not making it clear if they want, okay, we want one democratic state, but do you envision a democratic state that is essentially, Palestinian Arab Muslim state, or one that has constitutionally, allows everyone to stay and have certain amounts of rights. And so in a way, I think we get caught up because someone uses a word like a word that just triggers the end of a conversation instead of actually getting into the meat and potatoes of what people actually really want. So I think it's hard to, it's so easy to get caught up in one word or one debate, and that gets so tiring that's the same. But I think what's important is to try and push through and find out what people actually mean, and try not to get offended, and try to actually see, like, maybe there's disagreement, and maybe some disagreement's okay. But I think there's just actually so much discussion that's yet to be had, because in many ways there's so much stifling over this issue. So
Thank you. And I think we have a nice thank you as well from the audience to kind of wrap up this talk and the Q&A. From Stephen saying, as we have left the subject and move into contemporary politics, I will say thank you for both your talk and book. And I think we can join Stephen in thanking you as well.
thank you.